Gunfire cracked across the highway just after dark as the bus rolled through Tamaulipas toward Matamoros. Passengers jerked upright in their seats. Outside the windows, trucks closed in from both sides and boxed the bus in. Men in masks and military-style clothing climbed aboard with weapons in their hands and started demanding identification. Families who had already crossed half a continent froze where they sat. Some had children with them. Some carried the last cash they had. Most were headed for the border to wait for a legal appointment to request entry into the United States. Instead, on December 30th, 2023, on the road between Reynosa and Matamoros, dozens of migrants were pulled into one of the most terrifying traps on the northern route through Mexico. Reuters later reported the first public survivor account through Honduran migrant Noel Castillo and his sister Dilcia, who said the armed men abducted them and many others after storming the bus. The group on that bus included Hondurans and Venezuelans, and officials later said the abducted passengers ranged from a 71-year-old man to a 1-year-old baby girl, with 11 minors among them. Early official statements spoke of 31 kidnapped migrants because the baby had not been counted at first, but the total was later clarified as 32. The bus had departed Monterrey and was bound for Matamoros, across from Brownsville, Texas. According to Reuters and AP, the hijackers forced the passengers off near Rio Bravo and took them away in 5 vehicles. The region was not random ground for an ambush. Tamaulipas, especially the Reynosa corridor, had already developed a reputation for migrant kidnappings, ransom demands, and cartel control over roads that desperate travelers had little choice but to use. For the Castillo family, the trip north had already been a long flight from danger. Reuters reported that Noel Castillo and his relatives had left Honduras after gangs tried to forcibly recruit Dilcia's 2 teenage daughters. They spent months in southern Mexico before finally reaching Monterrey and boarding the bus to Matamoros, where they planned to wait while trying to secure a CBP-1 appointment to enter the United States legally. Castillo told Reuters that before the kidnapping, the bus had already passed through 2 official checkpoints where he said migrants were extorted for 500 pesos per person each time. Reuters noted that Mexican authorities did not immediately respond to the allegation and that the news agency could not independently verify it. By the time the armed men boarded the bus that night, the passengers had already been drained by fear, travel, and the sense that every stage of the journey exposed them to someone ready to take what little they had left. The kidnappers were not looking for random victims. Mexican officials said the motive was extortion. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador said the abductors targeted the migrants and their relatives in the United States for ransom money. Security Minister Rosa Isela Rodriguez later said the kidnappers took photos of the captives and, in the early hours of December 31st, called family members to demand payments. In some cases, she said, relatives made at least partial deposits. That detail changed the whole shape of the ordeal. The passengers had not simply been seized off a bus and hidden. They were being processed for profit, turned into leverage, and used to squeeze money from frightened families who might already have borrowed heavily to finance the journey north. The survivors were forced to endure not only the terror of armed captivity, but the knowledge that the people who loved them were now being hunted through a phone line. What those captives lived through in the hours after the abduction was only described publicly in fragments, but the fragments were enough. Reuters called the Castillo's account the first public narrative from migrants who survived the kidnapping. Noel Castillo described the shock of the gunfire and the trucks swarming the bus. Dilcia survived with him. The fact that Reuters interviewed them by phone on January 10th, only hours after they had legally crossed into the United States, gave the story a hard edge that official briefings did not have. These were not distant statistics. These were people who had been trapped on a bus, driven off into cartel country, held through ransom calls, and then kept moving because there was no safe way to turn back. Their survival did not mean the danger had passed. It meant they had stayed alive long enough to keep going. The search for the missing passengers became a major operation. A P reported that authorities reviewed surveillance footage from the bus, tracked cell phones, and used helicopters in the hunt. Presidential spokesman Jesus Ramirez said the Tamaulipas State Prosecutor's Office, the Army, and the National Guard were involved. But the public story of how the captives came out alive quickly became more complicated. Initial reports described them as rescued. Yet the next day, Lopez Obrador clarified that the migrants had actually been released by their captors. A P reported that they were left in the parking lot of a shopping center in Rio Bravo and that no arrests had been made. Reuters reported something similar, saying the group was found on Wednesday, after what the president described as a strong deployment by Mexican authorities, which he said led the kidnappers to abandon them. However the final moments unfolded, the result was the same. After days of terror, the hostages were back in the open, alive, and no longer in the hands of the gunmen. That outcome mattered because large bus kidnappings in northern Mexico did not always end this way. AP noted that organized crime groups in the border area regularly kidnap migrants for ransom and pointed to an earlier 2019 bus abduction in Tamaulipas in which about 22 people disappeared and were never seen again. Reuters had also documented a wider pattern of kidnappings in the Reynosa area the year before. In that context, the survival of the people taken from the Monterrey to Matamoros bus was not routine. It was the exception. They had been stopped on a highway controlled by armed men, pulled off public transportation, split away from any normal protection, and used as hostages in a criminal economy built on fear. Children, older adults, siblings, and whole family groups came out the other side, alive. That was the part worth holding on to. Not because it softened what happened, but because in that corridor, survival itself was never guaranteed. After the migrants were found, Mexico's Migration Institute said it would grant them humanitarian visas, according to Reuters. Reuters then spoke to Noel and Diltia Castillo as they crossed legally into the United States, carrying with them the memory of masked men, highway gunfire, and the knowledge that they had nearly vanished into the same border machinery that had swallowed so many others. Their story was newer than most survival stories and rawer because the systems around it were still in motion: the migration route, the ransom economy, the criminal control of border territory, the official scramble after public outrage. But at the center of it were survivors. They had been trapped, counted for money, and left to wonder if they would ever see daylight as free people again. Then they were released, found, and kept moving north, in a place where abduction could become disappearance. That was the difference between terror and obliteration. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.